Hello and welcome to Army of Crime, your favorite comic book adjacent podcast. Today we are slipping from the Euclidean bonds of sanity to talk about a 12-issue comic series called Providence, written by a fellow that you may have heard of before, a whippersnapper, a young rapscallion, if you will, named Alan Moore, and drawn by the person known as Jacen Burrows, who is a singular artist in a way that we will probably talk about once we get into this. But really, no one else could have drawn this, I don't think.
Well, I don't know about that, but we
You
can
don't
talk
think
about
so?
it.
Okay, sure. So we're talking Providence by Alan Moore, which is a 12-issue miniseries put out by Avatar Press that completes a sort of a triptych, if you will, or a trilogy of sorts, a quasi-trilogy on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, written by... In Providence, there's a lot going on there, isn't there, Dustin?
Well, I'm not sure how it's a quasi-trilogy because it's three things, so it is a trilogy.
I believe the first one is actually... Well, that's true. The first one was actually written by... wasn't it just a short story that was later adapted into...
The first comic book is The Courtyard, which was a short story written by Alan Moore that was adapted into a comic book drawn by Jacen Burrows. And then Alan Moore scripted himself a sequel to The Courtyard called Neonomicon. And The Courtyard was 2 issues. Neonomicon was 4 issues. And then you have the third part, which is a both prequel and sequel, which is twice the length of those put together, a 12-issue series called Providence. And these was once again drawn by Jacen Burrows. And the overall idea behind this we're going to mainly talk about Providence specifically, which is the meatiest one of these stories. And as I mentioned, it's kind of like a both prequel and sequel that sets up and finishes the whole story. So it's potentially the most standalone of these as well.
I think it is largely standalone.
But the idea behind this was an intent to sort of unify the so-called Cthulhu mythos as started by H.P. Lovecraft and then continued by other authors such as Clark Ashton Smith and August Derleth and many others. And Alan Moore had said, I know, that part of what he wanted to do was make the Cthulhu stories scary again, rather than, and we had talked about actually an H.P. Lovecraft adaptation already on this show at the Mountains of Madness. And obviously, and this is even mentioned in the story and shown, but you can buy like Cthulhu, t-shirts and plush, like Beanie Babies and what have you. So it's definitely like at a high point of cultural saturation. And Alan Moore had said that what he wanted to do was sort of unify it all into a coherent universe, which it kind of already is, but he sort of like folds it together in a way that makes much more sense. And also then to make the mythos scary again, like kind of bring it back to its horror roots in a sense, which is, I guess, a big buildup. But setting that aside, basically what Providence is a 12-issue series starring a character named Robert Black, who is investigating some supernatural occurrences of sorts and New England folklore for research on a book that he wants to write. And it involves him traveling all over New England and basically encountering all these fictional places or fictional people and creatures from H.P. Lovecraft, and also real people and real places that have all been kind of blended together into this story. So anyway, all that is to say, Matt, do you think that Providence is a good comic book?
Oh, yes, for sure. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Well, see you next time.
End of episode.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, how about we start with this? So you are more than I familiar with the writings of H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos stories. So, from that perspective, do you think that Moore and Burrows do a good job of kind of like honoring that stuff and sort of referencing it and redoing it and contextualizing it into their own story?
Yeah, so I think that's something that they do very well. And what's interesting is instead of just adapting one Lovecraft story, he's trying to like tell all of them or like a large number of them and wrap them inside one mega story, right? So he's not just adapting one story. He's attempting to like adapt Lovecraft's entire like output of stories into one super story, which I think is a much more interesting thing to try and do.
Right, and not just Lovecraft, uh, just him, because it also ties into other kind of weird fiction stuff that ended up being incorporated into what's called the Cthulhu mythos. Like at the very beginning, mention is kind of made of the King in Yellow, or the Yellow Sign, by Robert Chambers.
Yeah, and Ambrose Bierce, for example, is mentioned quite a bit throughout,
Right.
who I did not realize, I looked it up after reading this, did actually go missing.
Right. Yes, he appears in the end as a head in a jar.
I have his book right here, Ambrose Bierce's Weird Fiction. The title is "Can Such Things Be?" And it's I remember it being largely like ghost stories and stuff. I don't remember any of the standouts in it, but I have read it. So yeah, he's in that kind of milieu. And Robert Chambers. They mention who else? There's a lot of actual like real writers who get mentioned in it. Lord Dunsany,
Yes.
who's like the turn of the century fantasy author, is brought up. Algernon Blackwood is mentioned, who I've also read some things by. So it's a heady mixture of like interacting with real authors, and then there's of course his made up authors and stuff, which he mentioned. There's a story, I think it's issue number 2, where they said something like the most impressive thing Poe did was weave fact and fiction together, right?
Yes.
Which is like what he's doing as you're reading Providence, because they talk about Edgar Allan Poe a lot as well.
Right, they do. And they also talk about, and this is, I find really interesting, is it begins with, and I should say this is a little more of the story, but it begins with Robert Black, who is a closeted gay man, like deeply closeted, who is also Jewish, and he is not open really with anyone about either of those things. And he rejects, this is basically like the main driving force that sets the story into motion, is he has a boyfriend named, who he refers to by the nickname Lily, and our protagonist Robert Black rejects Lily because Robert is too basically anxious and pent up and too closeted to really like be in a relationship or really be open to anyone. And his rejection of Lily causes Lily to take his own life. And interestingly, the way that he does this is through a what they call an exit garden, which is basically just like a suicide booth that you can just go sit in and they kill you. And this is from Robert Chambers, the Repair of Reputation story. So at the very beginning, you already see ways in which they have folded these like weird fiction elements like into the world of this story, which seems mostly like the real world at the beginning, but already sort of isn't. So then Lily's suicide obviously is very traumatic to Robert Black, and he can't like publicly mourn for him because he's so deeply in the closet. And anyway, that kind of is what starts him out to want to get out of New York and maybe do research for this book that he wants to write.
Yeah, and it's not even that they borrow from the story Repair of Reputations by Robert Chambers, but they tell you that that's what they're doing. Because the characters in the story specifically mention something like, oh, isn't that weird that that thing from that story came true?
Right.
So you're like already living in a world that is blending fiction and like the actual past, which is kind of the big theme of Providence, I suppose. And this is where he takes, we talked about this in the At the Mountains of Madness episode, where, the question of, is there something underneath all of Lovecraft's various biases and prejudices and weird New England WASP hangups and the fact that he refuses to have female characters and all the rest of it. And the answer we came to was yes, there does seem to be, and Alan Moore is trying to tease out a lot more of that. So like the main theme is like the hidden reality or the hidden world that exists under our world, and you can see
Yes.
a lot of ways that will play out, right? So you to mention the main character is gay in a time where he doesn't feel comfortable being openly gay, and certainly it's like the 1917 is when the story starts. So that is very consciously part of the story. And the character even mentions that in the book that he's writing. He says something like he wants to have a story where someone is trapped in some kind of world that they don't want to be part of. And he wants to be able to talk about that through some kind of layer or like a lens so that he can, express some feelings openly without saying what they really are. And that's sort of what's happening throughout the entire 12 issues of Providence. And then, of course, that's kind of ties back to Lovecraft, who's always concerned about, like race mixing or something between like humans and fish people or whatever, which is then a cover for his actual concern about like too many immigrants or something like that.
Right.
And we're just kind
Yeah.
of so he's bringing like some things forward because in the story we see actual prejudice against in Lovecraft they live in the city of Innsmouth, but in here they just live in part of Salem, but they're like the part fish people.
Yes, the who have the Innsmouth look. But yes, so part of what's and we should also mention too that what makes Providence stand out too as a comic book is that, and this is obviously something that Alan Moore has done many times, like even in Watchmen, where each issue at the end will have sort of like in universe like extra material or like interviews with the characters and stuff like that. In each issue of Providence, well, not each issue, like I think most of the issues, well, at the end basically have the main character's journal where he writes down, and some of it is like him recapping some of the things that you saw in the comic book, but in more detail. And some of it is him writing out ideas for his book or copying out text from various pamphlets or other books that he comes across. The main thing being that he's looking for is this book called The Wisdom. Is it The Wisdom Beyond the Stars, which is sort of a stand-in for Lovecraft's Necronomicon. And he copies out part of the text from that into his journal or his commonplace book, as they call it.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, so, well, like you said, so basically, Moore and Burrows are taking very seriously this idea of the hidden reality or the hidden world, and they're using it in several ways because you have the horrors that we don't see of sort of like the Innsmouth people and like what Robert Sidum is doing with his basement and that kind of stuff, which are like horrors that are literally hidden away from the average person. And then you have the societal horrors, which are hidden beneath, such as like racism and anti-Semitism and the anti-gay attitudes that force Robert Black to stay in the closet. And then as it goes on, you also have this other layer of the dream worlds or the other like mathematical planes, which exist sort of above and below and like in concert with what we perceive as reality. And then, so as Robert Black goes on his journey, you like get to see the interplay between like all of these layers and like them coming together. And Matt.
Yeah, and I was going to add that not
Yes.
only is all of that happening, but they're like telling you that that's what's happening as it's happening.
Right. It's also in another kind of very Alan Moore-esque twist. It's a very meta comic book because it's about a writer and it's about him like reading fiction. So it's like very sort of self-aware of what it's doing as a piece of fiction.
Right. And when he meets, for example, Pittman, one of the characters who has like which is based on the Lovecraft story Pickman's Model.
Yes.
In Pickman's Model is the story where he draws like photorealistic portraits of ghouls that live in tunnels under the city, right? So you have like the literal people who live
Right.
in the underworld who come up, and then this guy is painting them, and then Robert looks at the painting and interprets the subtext of the painting, which is
Right.
like him looking at the text, but he thinks it's subtext, but he's reading the subtext into it that is actually, you know what I mean? It's like three layers of things happening at once.
Because Pittman, the real guy is the Lovecrafts is Pickman, right?
Right, yeah,
And
Pickman.
Moore and Burrows have Pittman. But yes, he is a guy who draws and photographs these ghouls eating people, which for him is like a representation of reality because the ghouls are real. But Robert Black like interprets it politically and says, "Oh, it's like I can see that these your work is very political," which I think is interesting too because Providence sort of ends up having a political angle with the all of these hidden layers of like sort of the inner rot of American society. In fact, the third issue of Neonomicon is called "The Shadows Over America."
And like it even starts, I think it's issue 7 starts with the policeman's riot. So
Yeah,
it's
there
like,
are several like real life events that go on. Yeah, so issue 7 has Robert Black arriving in Boston, and yeah, there's the policemen are on strike, and the city is caught up in a huge riot with the National Guard trying and failing to restore order. So there's like people being like raped and murdered right out in the street.
which is then a literal example of the like underworld rising up or something, which is
Right,
how he interprets Pittman's painting. And then, throughout the story, people make reference to like Jung and like the subconscious part of the mind.
right, which we see often in the story represented literally. But then as it goes on, it becomes more of like this metaphysical thing.
While
So,
also possibly being connected to a literal alien planet and another dimension, and also the past, and also the
a,
future.
and a higher mathematical plane called
Yeah.
Lang. So, I mean, there's a lot of different angles that you can talk about with Providence. You had talked about Jacen Burrows. So, what is it about? Talk about the visuals of Providence.
So Jacen Burrows' art is um it's like very like straightforward, I think would be a way of putting it. It's like
Yes.
it's almost like borderline simplistic in some ways, although it can be extremely detailed. When he'll draw some like the people, it's hard to even explain it. Like you'd almost have to look up an example of it because in some ways it looks very like I said, almost like straightforward or simplistic, but he puts a lot of detail into like buildings and details and like creatures, um and like what's happening. And like the story has, so like there's an example of a part where you have a woman who is a witch who is feeding her familiar, not something you would normally see. Right, you normally would talk about that, but he just like draws it straight up, and he does not spare any sense of modesty or like trying to cover things up with artfully placed shadows or whatever. So you get a lot of like naked people and graphic dismemberments and whatnot, and I think it all kind of works. It works with like how like straightforward his art is. You know what I mean? Like he's just showing you stuff almost in a, there's like a geometric quality to how, like he's not trying to gussy it up, right? You just have a story. There's like people. There's a lot of scenes of just people sitting around talking to each other.
So, I have the 12 issues of Providence, and I also have the box set that they put out, which has an art book called Dreadful Beauty. And in the introduction to the art book, Alan Moore talks about the how Lovecraft was in some ways a realistic writer, or would aim for a sense of realism in his work. And he mentioned sort of like how they have to go through the logistics of like an Arctic expedition in the mountains of madness and stuff like that. Like he wanted his horror to sort of be grounded first in the real world. And he mentions that Jacen Burrows very much does that with the horror in Providence, which I think is very true in that Jacen Burrows approaches this in a very realistic sense. And I think part of what helps that is the way that the panel structures, and Alan Moore is obviously a guy who is very strict, or is always making very specific choices about the panel structures of his comic books. And a lot of Providence, you have these pages where you'll have like 4 horizontal panels per page, like moving the story along. And a lot of the times you'll have like the progression of time in between each panel where like the camera is sort of like camera, if you will, in air quotes, like pushing in or pulling out and stuff like that. And it almost gives Providence like a sense of like documentary realism, which I think is very much what he's going for in that Lovecraftian realism, which I think is sort of what you're talking about, right?
Right. He puts the same level of detail into, there's like 2 people standing at a street corner, and it's not treated any different if you're just looking at like an empty building or you're looking at something horrifying happening.
Of previous Alan Moore collaborators, the way that Burrows' art works in Providence kind of reminded me of like Dave Gibbons in Watchmen, because I think they both have a sort of like draftsman sense of like this like sort of like strict geometric panels and like a sense of like architecture that I think is like really real. I mean, realistic is maybe not the best way to talk about art, because like that could mean all sorts of different things. But when you see like you're talking about the city streets and the architecture of the buildings and stuff, it's obviously like great care is being paid into making this like an almost photographic or documentary style like look at the way that these things actually look. And if you look, there's a lot of real places that get visited, and you can actually look up like photos of a lot of these like real places, and they look pretty similar. Like a lot of these buildings are real buildings.
Right. And I think because he adds like that sense of like weight to what's happening, and then when it does take the hard left turns into the weird stuff, I think it gives the weird stuff more
Right.
more like shock to you, right? Whereas if the whole thing was drawn in some kind of moody, like shadowy kind of art style, then it
Like
would
what you
perhaps
would
be,
expect. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say then it would be less shocking, I think, when it does take those hard left turns.
Because if you think of like, and this is an artist who I really love, but like maybe someone who's more archetypally a horror artist, like a Kelly Jones or something like that. Or you think of like Sam Keith drawing like early Sandman comics, and I'm sure there are much better examples, but their work is much more expressive and like grotesque in a sense. Whereas in Providence, I feel like that kind of like regular, you know, what you might consider like horror art would kind of work against what they're sort of going for here, which is like a sense of realism that then becomes that much more shocking, like you said, when it veers into these things which are not real and which, famously are meant to be sort of like undescribable or like under like things that are beyond human comprehension. Which of course raises that issue of like how do you draw and give definite shape to things which are not supposed to have definite shape.
Yeah, and I think it's telling that all of I mean, it's Avatar Press likes doing variant covers, so I'm sure there's like
Yeah,
hundreds of variant covers, but I believe all the regular covers are just pictures of buildings,
right. Yeah, they
which
are.
which is a testament to the the idea that this is like a grounded thing that takes place with like physical landmarks,
Right.
right? And like there's a lot of walking in the story. Like
Yeah.
Robert Black is always like traveling places, and it's always very specific on like where he's going. He's going by this street to that place. He's walking there. It takes him X amount of time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these issues are just like him traveling to different cities and meeting people and talking to them, which is
And then
not like a bad or really like a good thing. It's just kind of like the way this is structured. It's almost like a road story.
yeah, it's an odd structure. It's almost also like a Heart of Darkness kind of thing of like journeying deeper. The main character doesn't know that that's the kind of story he's in.
Right, because the heart of darkness that he's journeying towards is not a physical place. or is it? I guess
It is and it isn't, and it's
it is
also
and it isn't.
it's the heart of darkness of America, but
Yeah,
also the world, and also I was going to say, and this kind of ties back to when we talked about At the Mountains of Madness, but that interesting thing um, that Lovecraft does, and it's weird that, and they mention this in the story. This is actually a plot point of sorts within Providence, but the weirdness of the fact that Lovecraft has this level of cultural saturation,
right.
and it's not even like abundantly clear why. I mean, I think I've read like basically, I mean, probably not all, but like the overwhelming bulk of Lovecraft stories, and like they are cool, but there is a lot of flaws within them, certainly. And why does he have such a cultural reach? And it's interesting to even raise that as like a plot point within this. And it's interesting to have a lot of like, because as you mentioned, he does a lot of like the unknowable, the seventh dimension and the unspeakable geometry and this other stuff that really doesn't work visually. But I think they find a way to make it work here.
Yeah,
And
and I was saying that a lot of this is just him traveling around and meeting people. But I also, you had mentioned that you like this comic book, yeah, and I like this even more. I mean, I had read it before, and I loved it even more reading it again. It's very much like, despite how you might describe it as, it's not like an action story by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very readable and like very addicting once you like get into it. Because that whole thing of like, gradually peeling back the layers to see what's underneath is, of course, it's very addicting for the reader, us, and also very addicting for Robert Black, the protagonist.
yeah,
But
and also very appropriate thematically to an adaptation of Lovecraft.
yes,
And the text pieces at the end of the issues are used to great effect because he often explains things or comes up with ideas. He almost does like literary criticism too, because he talks about like Bram Stoker's Dracula and some of the weaknesses that might be in it. And he'll like go into more detail about things that happen in the story, because there's parts where you're like, man, this Robert Black guy really doesn't notice much, does he? It seems like there's things that he's like missing, and you think he's kind of oblivious. And then you actually read in the journal entries where he talks about them, and he does notice them. He just doesn't say anything. And it's an interesting trick from how comics normally work, because normally you'd put that in like a thought bubble or like a caption. But he's
right.
like taking a lot of those things and then removing them from the time that they actually happened in and placing them in the journal entries in the back of the story, which sometimes take place before the issue that you've just read. And sometimes they take place actually, like the timeline gets scrambled up because he often writes the journal entries after the thing that you just watched him do. Um,
Yes.
and then, but sometimes their journal entries actually take place like at the beginning of the issue. Um, so that the timeline gets a little jumbly there, but it's an interesting way of doing it that's like a lot different than how comics normally work. Like I said, normally you'd have like thought bubbles or like captions, and he takes that out and sticks it in the back in the journal entries.
Because am I correct in saying that there are no captions in Providence?
I do not believe there are. I think you're right. I think there are no captions, no like thought balloons or
Well, no
thought
one uses
captions.
thought balloons anymore.
Right, but like the equivalent of thought balloons.
Yeah. If you read The Courtyard, since it's an adaptation of a short story, it has that kind of like narrative captions. It was adapted sequentially by a guy named Anthony Johnston,
Okay,
who,
yeah, I know. Yeah, he's like an indie, I think more of an indie comics guy.
and I'm not sure exactly what Moore's involvement in that whole process was, but in Neonomicon and then in Providence, he doesn't use captions and kind of sticks to more of like this documentary sort of style. And one thing that I also really loved, and I don't know how much, I mean, it's weird to talk about spoilers because, like, if you know anything about H.P. Lovecraft stories, you know what the quote unquote bad guys are trying to do,
Right, and
which is
and
like
most
in the human
most
race,
yeah,
basically.
and most protagonists in Lovecraft stories end the same way, which is commented on multiple times in Providence.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Robert
it's
Black even thinks to himself at some point, I'm going to write a story, and what should happen at the end? Well, if the hero triumphs, then that diminishes the horror. But if he just gets killed off, then it seems futile. But what if he is lost to madness or kills himself?
right. And speaking of his journal or his commonplace book, I actually really like how that book ends up and it's not just like a place for like Alan Moore to pour out all of his, unfiltered thoughts, because Lord knows Alan Moore, if he got paid by the word, he would be the richest man in the world. That actually ends up taking a really like pivotal role in the plot.
Oh, right. His journal is actually an article, a thing that exists in the world, and characters will like pick up and like use.
Yeah, because, and this is getting into the larger plot, but he travels, and we can talk about if there's any specific issues that you want to discuss, but basically, Robert Black ends up, I mean, do we want to get this specific into the story? But basically, Robert Black ends up meeting H.P. Lovecraft, and the journal ends up being the seed that sparks Lovecraft's career, or his Cthulhu stories, I should say.
Right, which then explains why like Black is meeting all these people and things that are from Lovecraft, but they're all scrambled up a little bit, right? And then you pass them through to Lovecraft. It's like
And what it is we mentioned like the different layers of perception and reality. Is you have all of your evil Cthulhu mythos, Lovecraftian deities who are basically attempting to have their reality overtake our reality. And the way that they're attempting to do that is to use Robert Black and then use H.P. Lovecraft through him to sort of like seed these ideas into the world to the point where they can overtake our world with their world, which again is a very Alan Moore-esque idea, because he himself has talked about how like stories are magic, are like a form of magic that can be used to sort of put ideas into the world. And that's literally what is going on in the plot of Providence.
right, and it's very much because you talked about like the Necronomicon equivalent, which I think is called the Wisdom of the Book of the Stars, or Halley's book, is like this thing that was dictated from another planet / plane of reality or whatever, which then infects the Earth, and then like slowly like spreads over the Earth in various translations and forms. Right, like that's actually the instigating incident of the entire thing, is that book being created.
Right. And at one point they talk about how, the book being printed in Europe, and then basically we haven't even mentioned the Stella Sapiens secret society, which is the group of people who bring the book to the United States of America in the 1600s. And in I think Robert Black in his journal sort of talks about how America as a young country did not have its own mythology and its own sort of like history the way that the Europe did, so that by bringing the book to America, the secret society has basically created the American mythology and like seeded the path of American history.
Right, and there's a lot of there's a lot of things they talk about in there that are like, like historical stuff, because they talk about prohibition in it, and they talk about like women voting, and there's a mention of like KKK guys being tied in to the conspiracy, at least on some level, when they're in the dream world, which by the way is actually a very cool thing, like when they visit the dreamland, which is also one of the better, like Lovecraft has a lot of stories that take place. I don't know about a lot, but he has a whole cycle that takes place in the dreamland.
Yes,
Yeah,
Robert Black meets a guy named, in Providence, I think he's Randall Carver,
right,
which is an analog for Lovecraft's Randolph Carter, right? Who's the guy who can like travel through dreamscapes with his mind. And Providence is Carver and Robert Black go on such a journey in one of the later issues.
Yeah, and that's like a very cool like literal thing of what we're talking about, and like it ties into that like U.S. history. It ties into a lot of things. It's almost kind of fascinating to look at the number of layers that are like happening at once when things are happening.
Are there any specific individual issues that stood out to you? I mean, we're both in agreement that Providence is an extremely good comic book, and perhaps one of the best comic books that Alan Moore has done, at least in recent history.
Yeah, no, it's very good, and it's a testament to how good of you can put it up with the other Alan Moore stuff. I do think reading some Lovecraft stories probably increases perhaps the appreciation. You can find like the annotations online, which just tells you how much Alan Moore puts into this when people do like annotated versions. Um, but like I think the main like the I think some reading some Lovecraft certainly would help going into it. There's a lot of ones that I really liked, and there's some of them uh, that are kind of upsetting, kind of unsettling.
Yeah,
You might
Robert
you might
Black
say.
really goes through the ringer.
Yeah, he does go through the ringer. Like issue number 6 is kind of based off the case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is like a Lovecraft story. One of his, I think, better known stories about like a wizard who can possess. I think he possesses his own descendants. Um, I think number 5 before that is, I believe, references a story called Dreams in the Witch House, which has like a witch's familiar as a character. I do like when he meets, Pittman, who's like Pickman's model, is the story that's based off of.
Yeah, that's a good.
I mean, there's a lot of good ones. I don't.
He talks to a giant ghoul underneath Boston named King George,
Right.
which I learned was this is apparently an idea with ghouls is that they're named after the first person they eat. So King
He.
George is friends with another ghoul named George Washington.
Oh, right, because they eat the dead bodies. They don't have to eat.
They eat dead bodies. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
And I haven't read Pickman's model, but I believe Pickman becomes a ghoul or something.
Yes, there's a handful of Lovecraft characters that are, like plausibly we could call them. I don't know if heroic is the right word, but have some higher degree of agency in his world instead of just, relentlessly blowing their brains out at the end of every story. And Pickman is one of those characters who actually makes like a recurring appearance. And then like Randolph Carter would be another kind of recurring character. I think Tom Malone, who is also in this, is from the story. I think it's called Incident at Red Hook.
Yes.
Who's like a kind of macho, like two-fisted detective character, which Lovecraft does not normally use many of.
And Moore sort of subverts that by making him. I don't know that it's ever said explicitly, but it's pretty clear that he is also a closeted gay man like Robert Black.
Yeah.
Because as soon as they meet, they kind of start like flirting with each other.
Right.
We haven't even talked about this, but like one of the things that Moore and Burrows do in Providence, which is so fascinating and I think really smart, is how they take all of the sexual undercurrents from Lovecraft, who was famously a he's I think considered by some to have been perhaps like asexual, but his stories often will kind of like hint at sort of like quivering phallic masses and tentacles and the like, but they never actually go into like any kind of sexual activity. Whereas, so it's always like hinted at, and in Providence, Moore and Burrows make all of the hinted at sexual stuff extremely explicit.
Right.
In both senses of the term.
Right. Like in the Dunwich Horror is a Lovecraft about two people being created who have like an extra dimensional entity as their father. And of course, Lovecraft isn't concerned with the physical dynamics of how an extra dimensional entity could impregnate a person, right? You just kind of skip over.
Yeah.
But Alan Moore isn't a big fan of skipping over that kind of thing. Like he's just going to show it to you.
Right. Well, part of sort of the documentary realism of this comic book is the way that those kind of things are, the things that Lovecraft would perhaps be uncomfortable with are instead shown to you. And I think probably the most disturbing comic book or issue is, number 6, where he's in Salem and he gets to like read a copy of the book Beyond the Stars. And then he has an encounter with what appears to be a 13-year-old girl, but who is actually we come to learn, the spirit of one of the Stella Sapient founders inhabiting someone else's body. Which, it should be mentioned too, that frequent mention is made of the 4 different methods laid out in the book Beyond the Stars of prolonging life. And you see these 4 different methods being used by the founding members of the Stella Sapient to sort of keep themselves alive through the centuries as they kind of see this plan slowly come to fruition. And one of those methods is transferring your spirit into other people's bodies. So anyway, Robert Black meets what he thinks is a 13-year-old girl, but is actually like a 500-year-old man inhabiting a 13-year-old girl's body. And then he switches bodies with Robert Black and then uses Robert Black's body to rape the girl who is now containing Robert Black's spirit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they swap minds.
Yeah, and it's extremely sort of horrifying and leaves Robert very like traumatized as he literally flees Salem like on foot in a thunderstorm.
Right, and then the later characters are kind of talking to him, and he decides that it was some kind of hypnosis.
Yeah, it's one of those things that is mentioned frequently in these kind of stories of events so horrible that the mind cannot like fully grasp them or fully understand them. So he has to like rationalize it away.
Yeah, that was definitely that was unsettling. The final issue, I don't know if we want to talk about the ending because there's a lot to pick apart in the ending. And if you don't want to know, how it ends, that's fine because normally we don't go over like plot stuff, but I think there's a lot of things you could talk about with the ending.
Yes.
And so if you don't want to know what happened, I mean, you should go read it anyway. I would say go read. My official list would be like read Incident at Red Hook, Dunwich Horror. You could read Dagon and Beyond the Veil of Sleep, and there's like a couple other ones. But like The Strange Case of Randolph Carter, I'm probably getting some of the titles slightly wrong, but you can find that all online. But yeah, you should go read it definitely. But we'll talk about the ending because the ending is where he kind of brings you into something that Lovecraft always talks about, but never actually happens, which is like the rising of the ancient ones or whatever, which is a thing that they're always talking about, right? Like one day, the ancient ones will come back and up will be down and left will be right and everything will go screwy and everyone is in deep trouble. But he never really specifies what's going to happen. And of course, none of his stories ever take place, in the future or after that's happened or whatever. So Alan Moore just brings the whole thing back home to show you what the Lovecraft apocalypse would actually look like.
It's a book it's very readable, but there's also so much like depth to it that it really rewards rereading and, like you said, being familiar with all these other texts, these like stories and stuff that kind of inform it. I think very much accomplishes what they set out to do of bringing it back to a horror story and like making the idea of Cthulhu scary again, rather than like adorable.
Like there's a lot of Lovecraftian things, quote unquote, right?
Right. That's become like Kafka-esque. There's Lovecraftian.
Yeah, and they just kind of put the final word on all of that, like Alan Moore really does here. I think he puts the final word on all of that, and it's like, what else could you say about Lovecraft after reading Providence?
Yeah, would you really want like another take on it after this?
I
feel like him and Moore and Burrows really like tied the whole thing up with a bow.
Yeah.
It's certainly, like I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, works as a fairly standalone story, but it has such depth to it that your appreciation of it will only deepen as you reread it and as you become more familiar with all of the various historical and fictional things that they're riffing off of. Well, that has been another episode of everyone's favorite podcast, Army of Crime.
I was going to give a Lovecraft adjacent recommendation.
Oh, by all means, please do.
I was going to, if you've ever read the A Study in Emerald, have you heard of this? This is
I don't think so.
H.P. Lovecraft Sherlock Holmes mashup written by Neil Gaiman.
Okay.
It's kind of fun.
This is a novel?
It's a short story that was also adapted into a comic book.
Oh, okay.
But the short story was written by Neil Gaiman.
And the short story is good.
Yes, it's kind of it falls more into that like weird, turning Lovecraft into a cartoon thing to some degree, but it's written by Neil Gaiman, who's like a smart guy. So it's like well done.
Okay.
Because like I said, it has Sherlock Holmes in it. So, but anyway, back to your outro.
You can find us on the web at armyofcrime.com. You can leave us reviews or ratings on wherever you acquired this particular podcast episode. And I am Dustin. You can find me on Twitter. You can find Matt on Twitter at Army of Crime. I'm at Dustin44444. It's a very stupid username, I know. Until next time, stay alive out there, everyone.
You can cut that part out or something. I was like waiting for you to say something.